The classroom was already loud when the new teacher walked in. Phones out. Feet on desks. No one even pretending to listen. Emma wrote her name on the board. "Good morning." One boy laughed from the back row. "Relax, lady. Nobody listens to rookies." A few students stood up, circling her desk like it was entertainment. Then one of them grabbed her collar. "Shut up, bitch!" Another kid slipped an arm around her neck in a chokehold. The class started filming. Most teachers would have panicked. For Emma didn't. She just sighed quietly. Because the boy holding her had no idea he'd just put his hands on someone who survived deadly missions. And in about 3 seconds, he was going to regret it. If you believe respect should never depend on someone's job title, comment where you're watching from and subscribe, because today's story begins with a classroom that thought they had found the easiest teacher to bully. The bell had barely finished ringing when the noise started. Chairs scraping. Waiting for the noise to settle the way 10 out of life, waiting for the noise to settle the way experienced teachers often did. But this was her first week here, and the students knew it. The moment they saw the hesitation in her quiet posture, they decided exactly what kind of day this would be. Phones appeared on desks. One boy kicked his chair back so far it hit the wall, and another tossed a pencil across the room, like he was testing whether she'd say anything. Emma simply walked to the board and wrote her name carefully in clean letters. Ms. Carter. She set the chalk down slowly and turned to face the room. "Good morning," she said calmly. The words barely traveled past the first row before laughter drowned them out. At the back of the class, a tall boy named Tyler leaned back in his chair with the lazy confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. "You hear that?" he said loudly to the others. "She thinks we're gonna listen." A few students snickered. Someone near the window held their phone up, pretending to record the moment like it was already entertainment. Emma didn't react. She just rested her hands lightly on the edge of the desk and waited again. That quiet patience seemed to irritate them more than yelling would have. Tyler sat forward suddenly and slapped his hand on the desk. "Hey," he said, with exaggerated authority. "You're the new one, right? Rookie teacher?" A few voices echoed the word rookie, like a joke that had already caught on. Emma nodded once. "I'm new here, yes," she said evenly. "But we're going to start with attendance." That only made them laugh harder. The class had a rhythm to it, sort of kind of chaotic energy that fed on itself. One student imitated her calm tone. Another started tapping a ruler against the desk like a drumbeat. Emma walked between the rows slowly, handing out the papers she'd brought, moving with the same steady pace someone might use in a quiet library instead of a hostile room full of teenagers. It was subtle, but anyone watching closely would have noticed how balanced her posture was. For to them, silence meant weakness. Tyler, to them, silence meant weakness. Tyler stood up without asking permission and walked to the front of the room, leaning casually against her desk, like it belonged to him. "So what happens if we don't care about attendance?" he asked. Emma looked at him calmly. "Then you'll still be marked absent," she replied. So the answer wasn't angry, but it didn't bend either. Something in that calm answer sparked the next step. Two of Tyler's friends pushed their chairs back and joined him near the front, circling the desk with the casual confidence of boys who had never been challenged by an adult who meant it. Phones lifted higher now, a few students whispering and laughing as if they were about to capture something funny. One of the boys grabbed a marker off the desk and twirled it between his fingers. "You nervous?" he asked Emma with a grin. She didn't step away. "Should I be?" she asked quietly. That response drew a few surprised looks, but Tyler only laughed louder. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "You probably should be." Around the room, a few students leaned forward with anticipation, sensing the moment was escalating into something they'd talk about later. Emma didn't move as Tyler reached out suddenly and grabbed the front of her shirt near the collar. Gasps rippled through the class, half shock and half excitement. Phones rose higher. "Shut up, Batch!" Tyler snapped loudly, the word bouncing off the classroom walls in a way that made the room feel smaller. One of his friends laughed so hard he nearly dropped his phone. Emma's head tilted slightly as the fabric tightened under Tyler's grip, but her expression barely changed. If anything, she looked almost tired, like someone watching a mistake unfold in slow motion. "Look at her!" someone shouted from the 100th floor. "Look at her!" someone shouted from the back. "She's not even fighting back!" For a moment, Emma allowed the situation to stay exactly as it was. Her breathing remained steady. Her feet stayed planted exactly where they had been before the boys touched her. On the wall above the door, then briefly on the wall above the door, then briefly toward the hallway window. Small details, quick checks. The boy's arm tightened slightly around her neck as he leaned his weight in, trying to make the moment look more dramatic for the cameras pointed at them. "Say you're sorry," he laughed into her ear. "Say you're sorry for talking back." Emma didn't answer. The quiet stretched longer than the class expected, turning the laughter slightly uncertain. A girl near the front lowered her phone slowly. Something about the teacher's posture suddenly didn't look like panic anymore. Emma's shoulders were relaxed. Her balance looked centered even with the boy's arm pressing against her throat. She finally spoke then, her voice calm enough that it forced the closest students to lean in just to hear it. You should let go," she said softly. The boy holding her only laughed louder. "Or what?" he said. Around the room, several students waited for the explosion they expected from an adult pushed too far. But Emma didn't raise her voice. She didn't struggle. She just exhaled slowly, the kind of measured breath someone might take before beginning something they had done thousands of times before. Because the boy gripping her collar and the one holding her neck had no idea that the quiet rookie teacher standing in front of them had spent 8 years surviving situations far worse than a classroom full of bullies. And the moment she decided to move, everything in that room was about to change. For a long second, nothing happened. The classroom stayed frozen in that strange balance between chaos and expectation. Tyler's hand still gripped Emma's collar, the fabric twisted in his fist, while the other boy's arm hung loosely around her neck, like he thought he was the strongest person in the room. Phones remained raised, red recording lights blinking, as several students waited for the meltdown they expected from any teacher pushed this far. But Emma didn't shout. She didn't panic. She didn't even try to pull away. Instead, she took one slow breath, the kind that barely moved her shoulders, and her eyes lifted once more toward the clock above the door. "So got your tongue?" Laughter spread again. "Got your tongue." Laughter spread again, though it sounded less certain this time. Emma's head tilted just enough to look at Tyler without moving the rest of her body. "You really should let go," she repeated quietly. Tyler rolled his eyes. "Or what?" he mocked again, leaning closer to her face. A few kids at the front leaned forward in their chairs, sensing the moment had shifted from funny to something they couldn't quite name yet. One of the phones lowered slowly, as its owner noticed something strange in the way Emma's stance hadn't changed at all since the boys grabbed her. Then Emma moved. It happened so fast that several students didn't even realize what they'd seen. Her hand lifted calmly, not striking, but guiding, sliding between the boy's forearm and her throat with precise pressure in exactly the right place. In the same motion, she stepped sideways, shifting her weight in a way that instantly broke the leverage of the chokehold. The boy's arm slipped free before his brain could catch up. Tyler's grip on her collar tightened in surprise, but that only made his mistake worse. Emma turned slightly, her other hand catching his wrist with a controlled twist that redirected his balance forward. Tyler stumbled without understanding why, his body pulled toward the desk as if gravity had suddenly doubled. The room went silent. Tyler's chest hit the edge of the desk with a loud thud, his arm pinned in a firm but controlled hold that stopped him from moving without actually hurting him. The boy who had been behind her stepped back so quickly, he nearly tripped over a chair. Emma released the pressure just enough to let Tyler breathe, but not enough for him to pull away. Her posture remained relaxed, one hand guiding his wrist, while the other rested lightly against the desk to stabilize him. It looked effortless, not violent, just final. Phones that had been raised to record a teacher being humiliated now captured something very different. The moment the entire power dynamic flipped. Tyler's face flushed red with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "What the?" he started, trying to jerk his arm free, but the motion only tightened the hold for a brief second before Emma eased it again. She leaned slightly closer, speaking quietly enough that only the students nearest the front could hear her. "You're not hurt," she said calmly, "and you're not trapped. But if you keep pulling like that, you might be." The words weren't threatening. They were factual, delivered with the same calm tone she had used since the beginning of class. Around the room, the chairs creaked as students slowly sat back down without being told. Even the ones who had been laughing the loudest moments ago now stared in stunned silence. Emma released Tyler's wrist and stepped back, giving him space immediately. The sudden freedom left him off balance, both physically and emotionally. He straightened awkwardly, rubbing his wrist as if trying to understand how someone half his size had controlled him so easily. Emma smoothed the front of her shirt, where his grip had wrinkled the fabric, and picked up the marker that had rolled off the desk earlier. Her calm returned to the room, like gravity settling after turbulence. "You should sit down," she said simply, gesturing toward Tyler's seat. For a moment it looked like he might argue, but the expression in her eyes stopped him before he could. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his desk. The second boy hovered near the front like he wasn't sure what to do with himself anymore. Emma glanced at him briefly. "You too," she said. That was enough. He sat down immediately. The entire classroom watched as she turned back to the board and rewrote her name where someone had partially erased it during the chaos. The marker squeaked softly against the surface, the sound oddly loud in the silence. When she finished, she faced the class again. No anger, no raised voice, just quiet authority. "Now," she said evenly, "where were we?" No one answered, but every student opened the paper she had handed them earlier. At the back of the room, one boy whispered under his breath, "What just happened?" The girl beside him shook her head slowly. "I don't know," she said, but she didn't even look mad. That detail unsettled them the most. Most adults reacted with emotion when pushed. Emma had reacted with control. The difference felt bigger than the moment itself, and Tyler stared down at his desk, replaying the last few seconds in his head, and realizing he had never actually seen her struggle. She had simply waited until the exact moment she chose to move. Across the room, a few students quietly lowered their phones, no longer interested in posting the video they thought they were filming. A knock suddenly echoed through the classroom door. The principal stepped inside with the stiff posture of someone who had been told something serious was happening in his building. His eyes scanned the room quickly, desks in place, students sitting, Emma standing calmly at the front like nothing unusual had occurred. The silence in the classroom felt heavier than shouting ever could have. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. Tyler looked up nervously, then back down again. No one answered immediately, so Emma set the marker down and folded her hands loosely in front of her, waiting. The principal's gaze moved from student to student until it finally settled on her. Something in his expression changed slightly, though the class didn't understand why yet. Because the moment he recognized the calm posture, the steady breathing, and the way the entire room had somehow fallen under control without yelling, He realized exactly who his daughter had just handled, without breaking a sweat. And in the next few minutes, the entire class was about to learn why the quiet rookie teacher standing in front of them had walked away from a life most of them couldn't even imagine. Before we continue, if you've ever seen someone judged too quickly just because they looked quiet or harmless, comment, "Never judge" below. Because what the principal was about to tell that class would make every single phone in the room go completely still. The principal stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, scanning the classroom with the sharp eyes of someone used to sensing trouble before it escalated. Normally, when he walked into a room after a report of a fight or disruption, the evidence was obvious. Shouting students, overturned desks, teachers trying to regain control. But this room was different. 30 students sat in complete silence. It moved slowly across the desks until it moved slowly across the desks until it landed on Tyler, who sat unusually stiff in his chair, rubbing his wrist like he had touched something he didn't quite understand. The principal's expression tightened slightly. "Someone want to explain why I was called down here?" he asked calmly. For a few seconds, no one spoke. A couple of students glanced nervously toward Tyler, but the boy kept his eyes on the desk. Emma didn't say anything either. She simply waited. Finally, a girl near the back raised her hand halfway. "There was kind of a problem earlier," she said quietly. The principal stepped fully into the room now, closing the door behind him. "Kind of a problem?" he repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The girl hesitated, and then nodded toward the front of the room. Tyler grabbed Miss Carter, and Jake tried to choke her. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the words hung in the air. The principal's gaze slowly moved back to Tyler. "Is that true?" he asked. Tyler opened his mouth, then closed it again. The usual arrogance he carried around the school had drained out of him. It wasn't like that," he muttered weakly. The principal raised an eyebrow. "It sounds exactly like that." He looked back toward Emma then, studying her carefully. She met his gaze with the same calm composure she had shown since the beginning of class. No anger, no complaint, just quiet control. The principal sighed slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose like someone who had already pieced together more than the students realized. "Tyler," he said after a moment, "you should consider yourself very lucky." That sentence confused the room immediately. Several students exchanged glances, expecting the opposite reaction. "Lucky?" Tyler repeated, clearly unsure if he'd heard correctly. The principal nodded once. "Yes," he said simply, "because the person you decided to put your hands on today showed you a lot more patience than most people would." He turned toward the class as a whole then, his voice settling into a calmer, measured tone. "So I think there's something all of you should understand before this situation goes any further." The students leaned forward slightly, curiosity beginning to replace their earlier tension. The principal gestured lightly toward Emma. "Ms. Carter didn't come here straight out of college like most new teachers," he said. "Before she stepped into this classroom, she spent 8 years serving in the United States Navy." The room went still again. A few students blinked, unsure where the explanation was going. Tyler frowned slightly, clearly trying to connect the information with what had just happened. But the principal wasn't finished. He continued quietly. "Not just the Navy." He paused, letting the weight of the next words settle before he spoke them. "My daughter served as a Navy SEAL combat medic." The effect was immediate. Chairs creaked as students sat up straighter, the disbelief spreading across their faces almost in waves. Someone in the back whispered, "Wait, what?" Another student's phone slowly lowered to the desk. They all looked back toward Emma now, seeing her in a completely different light. Emma didn't react to the revelation. She simply stood where she was, eyes calm, posture relaxed. The principal folded his arms lightly. "Most of you probably think that's something you only see in movies," he continued. "But the truth is, if the job requires years of training most people will never understand." He glanced briefly toward Tyler again. "Training that includes learning how to stay calm in situations where panic could cost lives." Tyler swallowed hard, suddenly remembering how easily she had broken his grip earlier. The memory replayed in his head with new context now, and the realization made his stomach twist. The principal walked a few steps farther into the room. "Emma didn't leave the military because she couldn't handle it," he said. "She left after a mission overseas that didn't go the way anyone planned." The class remained silent, hanging on his words. "Some of the people on her team didn't come home," he added quietly. The statement landed heavily, shifting the mood of the room from curiosity to something closer to respect. A girl near the window lowered her eyes. I'm suddenly realizing how childish their earlier laughter must have sounded to someone who had lived through something like that. The principal continued. "After that mission, she decided she wanted to spend the next part of her life doing something different." He gestured towards the desks around them. "Teaching," he said, "sought helping students build better futures instead of fighting wars halfway across the world." The simplicity of that explanation carried more weight than any dramatic speech could have. Emma finally spoke then, her voice calm and steady. "That's why I'm here," she said quietly. The class looked back at her again, noticing the same controlled confidence that had been there from the beginning. "I didn't come here to fight anyone," she continued. "I came here to teach." Tyler stared at her for several seconds before slowly looking down at his desk again. The humiliation he felt earlier had shifted into something heavier now. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to embarrassment mixed with respect. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I didn't know," he said under his breath. Emma nodded once. "No," she replied gently. "You didn't." The way she said it carried no accusation, just a simple statement of fact. Around the room, Fit looked around the classroom once more, his face showing a mixture of surprise and concern. The principal looked around the classroom once more, his expression firm but calmer now. "What happened here today doesn't need to become something bigger than it already is," he said. "But I expect every person in this room to remember one thing." He paused long enough for every pair of eyes to focus on him, till you never truly know who someone is, or what they've been through, just by looking at them. The words settled into the silence like a lesson far more powerful than anything written on the board that morning. Emma picked up the marker again and turned back to the board, as if the conversation had simply been a brief interruption. "Now," she said quietly, writing the first lesson of the day beneath her name. Let's get back to class." Students who had barely listened earlier now leaned forward over their papers, paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Even Tyler kept his eyes on the board, the earlier arrogance completely gone. For the first time that morning, the classroom actually looked like a place where learning might happen. But just as the room finally settled into a new kind of quiet, a student near the door raised a hesitant hand. "Ms. Carter?" he said slowly. What exactly happened on that mission?" The question lingered in the classroom longer than anyone expected. 30 students watched Emma in silence after the boy near the door spoke, curiosity suddenly replacing the tension that had filled the room earlier. Emma stood at the board with the marker still in her hand, the words of the day's lesson half written but forgotten for the moment. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set the marker down carefully and turned to face the class again. The principal remained near the door, arms folded, watching the same way someone might watch a story unfold that they had already heard before. Emma looked across the room slowly, making eye contact with several students one by one, including Tyler. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried a weight that quieted even the smallest movements in the room. "Some stories aren't meant to be told in detail," she said gently. The answer didn't sound dismissive. It sounded honest. But look, she had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do something she didn't want to do. She had seen it before. People trying to get her to do look. She had seen it before. People trying to imagine something they had never experienced. She leaned lightly against the edge of the desk, her posture relaxed, but steady. "What I can tell you," she continued, "is that the job wasn't about being the toughest person in the room." A few students shifted in their seats, listening closely now. "It was about responsibility," she said. "When things went wrong, you didn't panic. You focused on the people next to you and did everything you could to make sure they made it home." Her words landed quietly, but they carried an impact far stronger than any dramatic explanation would have. The class seemed to shrink inward a little as the reality behind the story became clearer. Tyler stared down at his desk again, replaying the moment he had grabbed her collar earlier that morning. What had seemed like a harmless show of dominance now looked painfully childish. Emma noticed the change in his expression, but didn't point it out. She didn't need to. The lesson was already unfolding in front of everyone. The principal stepped forward slightly, resting a hand against the back of an empty chair. "Emma doesn't talk about that mission much," he said calmly to the class. "But I remember the night she came home." The students looked up again, but lost. And the ones who survived because lost. And the ones who survived because someone stayed calm when everything else went wrong. He glanced at his daughter for a moment before looking back at the students. "That kind of discipline doesn't disappear just because you change jobs." The room stayed silent. A girl near the front raised her hand slowly this time, her voice quieter than before. "So, why teaching?" she asked. Emma smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she had shown since the morning began. "Because most problems in the world don't start on battlefields," she replied. "They start in places like this." Several students glanced around the classroom instinctively. Emma continued, "If people learn respect, patience, and responsibility early, Fewer people grow up thinking violence or intimidation is the answer. She paused for a moment, on letting that thought settle. Teaching seemed like a better way to spend my time. Tyler cleared his throat suddenly. The sound drew the attention of the entire room. For a moment, it looked like he might change his mind about speaking, but then he pushed his chair back and stood slowly. The arrogance he carried earlier had completely disappeared. "Miss Carter," he said awkwardly, avoiding eye contact at first. "I shouldn't have done that." The apology was simple, but it carried more honesty than the class had expected from him. Emma nodded once. "No," she said gently. "You shouldn't have." There was no anger in her voice, just acknowledgement. Tyler shifted uncomfortably before continuing. "I didn't know," he added quietly. Emma looked at him for a moment, then answered the same way she had earlier. "You didn't need to know," she said. "Nah, respect isn't something people earn after you hear their life story." A few students nodded slowly as the meaning settled in. The principal watched the exchange with a small approving expression, but didn't interrupt. The moment belonged to the class now. Emma turned back to the board and picked up the marker again. She finished writing the lesson title that had been interrupted earlier, Responsibility and Leadership. When she stepped aside, the words seemed to carry a deeper meaning than the students had expected when they first walked into the room. "Let's try this again," she said calmly. "Open your notebooks." This time there were no jokes, no phones raised to record. Pages turned quietly as students actually followed the instruction. The rest of the class period passed differently than it began. Students who had barely paid attention earlier now listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Emma with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The story of the morning would spread through the school by lunchtime, but inside that classroom, the lesson had already taken hold. Tyler kept his focus on the notes he was writing, determined not to repeat the mistake that had nearly humiliated him earlier. When the bell finally rang, chairs moved more quietly than usual. Students packed their bags without the usual rush to the door. As they left, several of them paused briefly near Emma's desk, offering small nods or quiet thank yous that they might not have understood themselves a few hours earlier. Tyler was the last one to leave. He hesitated at the doorway before turning back once more. Emma met his eyes calmly, and he gave a quick nod before stepping into the hallway. The principal remained in the room after the students left, leaning casually against the desk. "You handled that better than most people would have," he said with a faint smile. Emma shrugged lightly. "They're kids," she replied. "Kids make mistakes." The principal nodded slowly. "Still," he said, "I think they learned something today." Emma looked around the now quiet classroom, sunlight spilling through the windows onto rows of empty desks. "I hope so," she said. She picked up the papers she had brought at the beginning of the class and began organizing them again, the same way she had planned to before the morning spiraled into chaos. Outside in the hallway, students were already talking about the story they had just witnessed, but Emma didn't seem interested in the attention. For her, the moment was over. Because for Emma Carter, being a teacher wasn't about proving how tough she was. It was about making sure the next generation learned something stronger than intimidation. And if stories like this remind you that real strength is often quiet, that the calmest person in the room may have faced the toughest battles, then consider subscribing and staying with us. Because sometimes the greatest lessons in life don't come from books. They come from the people brave enough to stand in front of a classroom and teach them.